Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. This is to be my lecture on Descartes' Meditation 3. We've had a background lecture on Descartes and his meditations. We had a lecture on Meditation 1. We had a lecture on the first part of Meditation 2, right? The bulk of it. There's a part at the end about a piece of wax that we call the wax meditation. We've had a lecture on that. Right now we're ready for Meditation 3. Where does Meditation 3 fit into the big picture? Well, Descartes was very destructive in Meditation 1, right? He says he successfully doubted everything that he knew going into this doubting project, right? In Meditation 2, he starts to get constructive. He finds this certain Archimedean point, right, that he can use as a foundation. So in Meditation 3, he begins to use his foundation that he found, right? You will recall that that foundation is I am, I exist, is completely certain whenever thought or uttered. Okay, so Descartes' going to use that proposition, which probably doesn't seem very promising, right? Because it's about me. I am, I exist, which seemed obvious anyway. So how are we going to really build on that? Well, let's see, right? What does he do in Meditation 3? Let's get into it. So he says, since I know something completely certain, don't I also know what it takes to be completely certain of something? Maybe there are different ways to be completely certain of something, and maybe the way you're certain of one thing is different from the way you would attain certainty of some other thing, but okay, let's let's set that aside. Maybe there's a single recipe for certainty and knowledge, so maybe it's the case that if I'm really absolutely 100% certain of one thing, and I know, what it takes to be completely certain of that, which Descartes says is the case here, maybe that has some bearing on other knowledge, right? So that's how we get from this certain proposition to more knowledge. Don't I know in general what it takes to be certain that something is true? Descartes says yes. Okay, so what does it take then? How can I be certain? Well, what I have in this case, the case in question, he doesn't actually pick on the I am, I exist proposition. He picks on this point that I am a thinking thing. And he says, okay, I'm completely certain of that. I'm completely certain I'm a thinking thing. What does my certainty consist in? How am I certain of it? Well, I have this clear and distinct perception that makes me certain. Okay, that seems fair, right? So think about it. What does clear and distinct mean? Clear means nothing is hidden or obscure. I mean, clear can mean see-through, but that can't be what he means here, right? So clear has to mean I can make it all out. Nothing is missing, nothing is hidden behind something else. There it all is. I can get it all into view. I can grasp it all at once. That seems to be what clear means here. Now, distinct means I can make it out from other things around it. Right? So clear and distinct are related terms, but they do have different meanings, right? Clarity seems to be the inner articulation. Distinctness seems to be that separation from the surrounding context. So both of these things are important, right? Do I have a clear and distinct perception that I am a thinking thing? I would say yes. I agree with this point, right? If I say it, let's go back to that original proposition. I am, I exist, okay? So I think to myself, I exist, okay? Now, that's just a subject and a predicate. I exist, okay? There's nothing obscure about it. Everything that is exists, right? It's sort of a mundane quality for things to have. I seem to be familiar with myself. I'm one of those people who talks to myself and has an inner monologue. Apparently not everybody has an inner monologue, but I do. Okay, so yeah, I'm used to talking about myself in terms of I, externally and internally. I know what it is to exist. It's just two words and two concepts in the proposition. It seems easy to grasp it all at once. And can I tell I apart from, the computer screen or the mouse or the microphone in front of me? Well, those could be illusions, but I can tell myself apart from the illusion that I'm having, or I could tell myself apart from the actual microphone. Either way, seems to me, right? And yeah, I mean, that's it. So I say I exist to myself, and it's clear because I understand both terms and both concepts. And I'm very familiar with them, actually. And I can tell I exist apart from the microphone exists, right? And I can tell the microphone apart from me, or I can tell the illusion of the microphone apart from me, and so on. And so, yeah, I have a clear and distinct perception that I exist, and it does make me certain that I exist. Certainly in the moment that I'm having the clear and distinct perception, it makes me certain. It seems adequate. I don't know what else I could want in this case, right? Now again, when we try to generalize from here, I'm less certain, right? So all it takes to know about anything is to have a clear and distinct perception. I'm not so sure about that. But in a way, Descartes saying, well, that's what we've got. There's nothing else coming forward as lending certainty, as being conducive to the construction of knowledge. So we'll go with these clear and distinct perceptions. He sounds more confident than I do right now, and so maybe he is. But in his defense, at least, I would say, well, what has emerged as being helpful here is a clear and distinct perception, a CDP. I like to say CDP. I got used to that in graduate school. I had a professor who would say CDP over and over again. All right, so I've got a CDP, and it's really useful, and I feel like it's adequate, and I feel like I have complete certainty when I have the CDP. So let's look for more CDPs, basically, is what Descartes says. I'm going to be honest and say his actual argument right at the beginning of Meditation 3 looks a little circular. So this is page 104. Right, he says, I am certain that I am a thinking thing, but if that is the case, do I not then also know what is required for me to be certain about something? That's the line of inquiry I was just suggesting. There is, to be sure, nothing in this first knowledge other than a certain clear and distinct perception of what I am affirming, and obviously this would not be enough for me to be certain about the truth of the matter if it could ever happen that something I perceived just as clearly and distinctly was false. That's where it looks circular to me. And now it seems to me, and now, oh, he does say now twice. I thought I was misreading that. And now it seems to me that now I can propose the following general rule. It's in the text. All those things I perceive very clearly and distinctly. All those things I perceive very clearly and very distinctly are true. He says very twice as well. The very is a little weaselly. What does it take for something to be very clear and very distinct? I don't know. He doesn't say. So I'm worried about that. But he also just says, I have this CDP. It makes me certain. That couldn't be if a CDP could ever tell me something false. Therefore, it only tells me true things. I mean, what? Have we checked a bunch of CDPs to see if maybe some of them give us false impressions, and what would we even check outside of our CDPs to see if they did give us false impressions? Yeah, that's a bit of a mess. So again, my take on it, which I hope is helpful, is, well, this is what we've got. We doubted everything. We found a certain Archimedean point. There was a CDP involved. Let's look for more CDPs, right? And so that's basically what Descartes says. He does say that last part, like, well, let's look in our minds and do a mental inventory and see if we can find any more CDPs, okay? And right off the bat, he says, well, I used to think of arithmetic and geometry as having a lot of CDPs, right? I CDP that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I CDP that triangles, angles add up to 180 degrees, right? And so on. I used to think about things that way, but then I came up on this really metaphysical doubt in Meditation 1, right? I thought, well, maybe God is messing with my mind, right? Maybe I hold this proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4 before my mind, and it looks very compelling. It looks like it must be true. It's so clear. There's the 2, there's the 2. Oh, they make 4. Yeah, that's got to be right. But if God is interfering with my mental processes while I'm doing that, then possibly, even though 2 plus 2 equals 4 seems very clear and distinct, possibly it's false anyway. Right, so there was that metaphysical doubt, we could call it, right? It's kind of removed from regular reality. It's not as mundane as something like I exist. If we could defeat that metaphysical doubt, then we would rehabilitate arithmetic and geometry, which would add a lot to what we know. And so that's really what Meditation 3 is about now that we've gotten going here, right? We had to establish some kind of standard for truth, some kind of criterion, right? And we got it. We got the CDP. And so the rest of Meditation 3 involves trying to use that criterion, right? Let's look at arithmetic and geometry. We see that they're clear and distinct. Oh, but there was this metaphysical doubt. Let's remove it so that arithmetic and geometry now securely belong to the knowledge we have. Makes sense? We hope. Okay, so Descartes got to find as many CDPs as he can. He ends up dividing up his thoughts into certain kinds, certain kinds. A different translation is definite categories, right? So you could think of either of those phrases. What he wants to know is whether there are certain categories of thought that are more clear and distinct than others. Okay, so what categories or what kinds do we end up with? Well, there are ideas, which are like images, so we'll come back to that. And then there are other kinds of thought that sometimes we call them, we philosophers at least, sometimes we call them attitudes, propositional attitudes. So there's judgment, and there's feeling, and there's volition, right? A judgment is affirming or denying, or that's sort of an aspect of judgment. So there's some content there, some propositional content, and you say, yes, that really obtains, that really is the case. Or you say, no, that's not the case, right? So a judgment is the propositional content plus the affirming or the denying. Like I said, feelings, according to Descartes, those also have some kind of conceptual content. So we could question that, but I'm telling you Descartes' view right now. So Descartes' view is, if you're experiencing love, then it's love of something, and if you're experiencing envy, then it's envy of someone, probably. Or if you're experiencing excitement, your excitement is about something. So again, with judgment, there's some kind of propositional content, and then there's the affirming or the denying. With feeling, there's some kind of conceptual content, maybe propositional content, Descartes is saying. I don't know if he quite wants to go that far. And then there's the feeling sort of makes you experience that proposition or the conceptual presentation in a certain way. You feel a certain way about it. We're getting kind of deep into philosophy of mind here, so I hope that's okay. And then volition, that's an act of will, which I feel like it's understudied these days. What is the will? It's your executive faculty. There has to be something that sets you into motion. You can sit and you can ponder, you can have feelings. You don't always just act on them spontaneously. Sometimes you reach a decision, you form an intention, and then you act on that, right? So the will is this executive function within you, right? And again, there must be a propositional content. You don't will in an empty way. You will that this or that happen. You will that you bring this or that about, right? So we've got, let's sum it all up now. We've got ideas which can be put together in presentations, which can be put together in propositions, is what I meant, but really both. Okay, so ideas are like the atoms of thought. You put them together, and that allows you to think about states of affairs that obtain in the world. And then judgments are affirming or denying those thoughts. So you have this constructed thought, and you say, yes, that actually is the case, that obtains, or no, it doesn't. when you have a feeling, again, there's maybe a propositional content, definitely at least a concept. Something is presented to thought, and you experience it lovingly or enviously or jealously or joyously, etc. Right? The feeling lends a certain coloring and motivates you in a certain way, but then doesn't typically force you to act. So then there's volition, right? So you can have this idea of a state of affairs, and you can have a volition that it come to be through your action, through your agency. Okay. Hope all that makes sense. Are some of these things more clear and distinct than others? Okay, well, the atoms, the ideas, which Descartes is willing to also call images, they're clear and distinct in themselves. If I don't think of them as representing things external to me, I just think of them as ideas, then they're clear and distinct enough. In other words, I mentioned earlier, maybe it's just an illusion of a microphone, but in any case, there it is, right? There it is. Which is to say, I certainly have an image of a microphone in my visual field. Is there a microphone? I don't know. So if I just limit myself to there's that thing in my visual field, well, that's clear and distinct, right? You see what he's saying. Feelings, we could argue with Descartes about it, but he says they're clear and distinct. I know whether I'm feeling envy. I know whether I'm feeling joy. I don't really agree that's always true, but nothing's occluding. There's certainly no physical thing occluding your view of your own feelings. So I know why he says what he says. So fine, let's just go with him. Sure, feelings are clear and distinct. Volitions are clear and distinct. I know when I'm having a volition. I'm more willing to buy that. It is your executive function, so I certainly know what I'm trying to execute. It wouldn't make much sense, I think, if I didn't know what I was trying to execute exactly. Okay, so ideas, feelings, volitions, yeah, clear and distinct. The problem is judgments. With judgments, I'm typically trying to judge that the ideas I have actually tell me what the world is like, and that's where things get tricky. So now I've honed in on where there is clarity and distinctness and where there isn't clarity and distinctness. But then the thing is, we could theoretically, or in the absence of other considerations, we could say, well, let's ignore judgments and focus on the other things that we have clear and distinct perceptions of, that we have CDPs of, but that's not going to work. Descartes' trying to do science, right? He's trying to lay a foundation for science. We're going to have to secure some of our judgments in order to do science, because in science we want to say what the world is like. We want to say what obtains. Okay. So we've honed in on judgment as a problem, and it's a problem that needs to be solved if we're going to do science. So in a way, that is also what Meditation 3 is about. I know I already said what Meditation 3 is about, but a different way to look at the same thing, I would say, is Are there some judgments we can be sure of? Are we going to be able to say anything about the external world at all? Descartes says yes, of course. Okay, so we get other divisions. We just divided up thoughts into definite categories so we could see where the clarity and distinctness is or isn't. Descartes also divides up ideas according to their sources, right? It's not anything surprising here. He says, well, some ideas are innate. That is to say, they're just internal to you. You just have them. They're there inside you, right? Makes sense. I mean, John Locke will disagree because he's an empiricist, but you know what an innate idea is. I mean, something like the number one. You could easily generate the number two if you have the number one, right? But where does that number one come from? Well, you use it to conceptualize unity and singularity in the world, but where does that concept come from? Like, you can always look at something and think of it as one thing, or you could start analyzing it in your mind. It makes sense. I'm not saying it's definitely true. It makes sense to think of the number one or unicity or singularity. Maybe those are slightly different concepts. Maybe they're different sides of the same concept. But anyway, it makes sense to see that as innate. And then you could build up other concepts from there. Anyway, some ideas are innate. Some certainly seem to come from outside. That's become a problem for us. Are there really any ideas that come to us from outside? Well, by the end of meditation 3, Descartes thinks we can say yes. But it is a problem right now. So some ideas are innate. Some seem to come from outside. Well, some we just make up, right? The idea of a unicorn, I personally didn't, but we have made it up. It's the idea of a horse and the idea of a horn on the head, and you just slap them together, and there you go. Now you have the idea of a unicorn. Okay. So again, in the past, it seems like, there have been all these ideas that have entered into me from outside. So if I think about whether there are any ideas that come from the outside, it seems like that happened a lot in the past, but now we've come to doubt it. So we'll have to tread more carefully now, right? So, in that vein, again, this meditation is a mess, right? I think I've tried to present it many different times in many different ways, and it just ends up being a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So we divided up our thoughts into definite categories. Then we think about the origins of different thoughts. And then that leads us to this other idea, almost through association. Right now we're not sure if any ideas came to us from outside, but let's take a different tack. Let's look at it this way. Some ideas have more objective reality than others. Descartes. What does that mean? So Descartes divides reality up into formal reality and objective reality, and I don't know if he means for that to be exhaustive, but there's no other relevant reality here. So let's take it that everything divides up along those lines. Something either has formal reality or it has objective reality. Now, big warning, this is not what it sounds like, okay? It's kind of the opposite of what it sounds like, and I'll explain. So objective reality is the kind of reality that belongs to ideas. Why? Maybe if I explain it, it'll help you remember better. When Descartes talks about objective reality, he's thinking of ideas as the objects of thought. Okay, so it's weird to say ideas are what have objective reality, but that's how he's thinking about it. He's thinking ideas are the objects of thought. So objective reality, that the kind that objects of thought have. Okay? So that's the terminology here. And then formal reality, again, formal reality is the kind of reality that actual things in the actual world have. Well, why would you call that formal? That's confusing. This seems to be another connection to Aristotle. I'm not going to try to work that all out right now, but basically, from an Aristotelian point of view, a thing's form makes it what it is, right? So my form actually is a certain configuration of my body that allows my biological functions to be carried out. This is Aristotle's notion of hylomorphism. The mind is the form of the body, or the soul, if you like, is the form of the body. So matter in itself can't do much. So thinking from a functional perspective, it's the form of things. I mean, this has got some credibility, plausibility. It's the form of things that allow them to do what they do. So it's the form of a thing that makes it what it is. So formal reality is the reality that things have in themselves. Okay, so granted, confusing terminology, sounds the opposite of what it is. I've tried to explain it, so hopefully that helps. Okay, so remember, I already said, well, some ideas have more objective reality than others, and I paused to try to explain that. So objective reality, again, is the kind that ideas have. So some ideas present more reality than others. Something like that. So what does that mean? Well, this is an example. This is not Descartes' example. This is an example that I like to use, though. I've used it many times. Think of a nice 3-story house with 4 bedrooms and 2 baths and, well constructed, energy efficient. Think of that. Okay. I'm thinking of it, and I'll tell you, my thought is vague. I don't know much about architecture or engineering, and I've never owned a home. It's not my desire to own a home. I'm not drawn in that direction for some reason. So my idea of a nice house is pretty vague, not well developed, right? But now imagine someone, maybe you are the someone who has studied architecture and studied engineering and studied efficient energy flow, maybe as part of some engineering program. And suppose that person imagines a well-constructed house with the 4 bedrooms and the 2 baths, and it's energy efficient. Well, that idea of a house is going to be really nice and maybe executable. Let's just grant it to them. They're an architectural engineering genius. They can just think of an idea of a house in their head that could actually be built and really would be energy efficient if built the way that they imagine it. Okay? So that person's idea of a house has more objective reality than my idea of a house. Their idea of a house has richer, more articulated, more clear and distinct conceptual content. Right? I mean, that makes sense as far as it goes. So yes, I think we could allow Descartes that some ideas have more objective reality than others. And then we could allow that there should be, maybe not must, maybe that's a bit strong, there should be some explanation of that. It's not just randomly the case that this other person's idea of a house has more objective reality than mine, right? It's not just how it just happened to be. Rather, that person got some training, that person got some degrees, that person studied for a long time, and maybe that person just has a better imagination. Let's face it. I don't have a very good visual imagination. I feel like I have a good imagination in some respects, but I don't have a very good visual imagination, right? But this person does. Okay, so some ideas have more objective reality than others, and then there's something that accounts for that, right? Now in the text, in the text, Descartes eventually says it is not the case that something can come from nothing, and he couches that as a conclusion, and that's on page 107. I'm not going to get into the text again, but he's talking about where that extra objective reality comes from, and he says, well, it's not the case that it comes from nothing. It's not the case that something can come from nothing. He acts like that's a conclusion. He says, well, some ideas must have more objective reality than others. The cause of the idea must have more reality than the idea. Therefore, it's not the case that something can come from nothing. That's part of the mess. Okay, this is. I've already admitted it. I'm sorry if that's ruining your fun. Maybe you feel bad about reading a messy meditation, but we have to work through this to understand the whole project. This is a key part of the project, securing the existence of God. So some scholars, especially Janet Broughton comes to mind, have said, well, he's misspeaking or something. Maybe he's just misspeaking. Let's take it as just a premise, not a conclusion, that it's not the case that something can come from nothing. Let's take that as a basic principle. In other words, that's what Descartes should have done. So maybe that's what he meant. It's not the case that something can come from nothing. Some ideas have more objective reality than others. Therefore, and so here's an okay argument. If we sort of move bits of text around, we get an okay argument. Therefore, based on what I've already said, whatever the formal cause of the idea is, it must contain at least as much reality as we find in the objective effect. Right? So remember, formal reality is the kind that things in the world have. So then, in theory, we think these ideas which have objective reality are caused by things that have formal reality. Right? So to read, maybe we should read the whole principle. which is on page 107. Let's see. This is the top left of 107. Descartes says, "Now it is surely evident by natural light that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of this cause. For from where, I would like to know, can the effect receive its reality if not from its cause? And how can the cause provide this reality to the effect unless the cause also possesses it? From this it follows that something cannot be made from nothing." That's where it's a little confused, I think. From this it follows that something cannot be made from nothing, and also that what is more perfect, that is, contains more reality in itself, cannot be produced from what is less perfect. This is obviously true not only of those effects whose reality is what the philosophers call actual or formal, but also of those ideas in which we consider only what they call objective reality. Okay, so here, again, here's my version of the argument that I think Descartes could have put forward and has some plausibility. Some ideas have more objective reality than others. It's not the case that something can come from nothing. Therefore, even when it comes to ideas and their objective reality and their causes, which have a formal reality, we would expect, we believe that the causes with the formal reality have to contain the perfection that we find in the effects, which are those ideas with objective reality. Okay? We're going over this body to mind gap as if we're not worried about it, so that's concerning. But the general principle seems sound. The general principle seems sound. The total and efficient cause must have at least as much reality as we find in the effect, right? Leaving the mind-body gap out of it. That's what the principle says. Efficient cause, by the way, it's another Aristotelian term. When we think of cause, we think of efficient cause. It's like the trigger, the thing that made it happen. So the efficient cause is just the thing that made it happen. What is the total and efficient cause of something? Well, sometimes different causes contribute to an effect, right? So if there are multiple causes, then the effect could get some of its reality or perfection from one cause and some of its reality or perfection for another cause. So there may not be a single cause that has all the reality or perfection that we see in the effect, but the total efficient cause must have at least as much reality or perfection as we see in the effect. Right? I mean, and some, again, that principle, leaving the mind-body gap out of it, has a lot going for it. A stone statue, for instance, this is Descartes' example. He gives some example like this. A stone statue, right? There are multiple causes. I mean, there's the stone, and of course the sculptor might have made it from more than one stone. So if you put up all this, if you put together all the stones that the statue was made of, there must be at least as much stone there, just in terms of quantity, as we find in the statue. You can't get some stone out of nowhere. So if you take all the stones that you produced the statue from, there's at least as much stone as we find in the statue. That's an application of the principle. That seems right. Or if you're trying to heat something, maybe we want to heat something to 100 degrees. Well, you know, there must be a source of heat that's at least 100 degrees, and really you want more. Just like with the statue, you're gonna chisel some stone away. You really need more stone than is going to end up in the statue. And then if you're trying to heat something to 100 degrees, you probably want a source of heat that's more than that, and then you use it until the thing you want heated is up to 100 degrees, and then you remove the source of heat. Okay? So the principle is not terrible. Applying it to, causes with formal reality and effects with objective reality, that's really where the problems lie. But I'll have to leave it at that, right? You think about whether you could really apply the principle in that way. All I can say is that's how Descartes applies it. And he says, okay, so some ideas have more objective reality than others. Is there some idea with so much objective reality that I couldn't have produced it, right? I may not have enough formal reality to have produced it. Is there an idea like that? And then if there is, then that suggests that there's something other than me. There's something outside of my mind that has the right amount of formal reality to produce this idea that has just so much objective reality that I couldn't have produced it. Okay, so having got to this point, I think you know what idea is at issue here. It's okay if you don't. I just think, this is where all the roads have been leading, so probably it's apparent. Descartes spends some time ruling out things. He thinks about external objects. Do they really have so much? Do my ideas of external objects have so much objective reality that I couldn't have made them? No, they don't. They don't have that much, right? Basically, I have sense impressions, which are kind of in a way just modes of thought, and I'm a thinking thing, and so I could just make up certain modes of thought, and that's fine. What about the very idea of material substance, right? When I thought about what the wax really was, I thought it was extension. Now that's different from sensory stuff. That's actually a robust concept, or at least that's what Descartes has said. It's this abstract concept that you could sort of use to put different sensory impressions together. That's how he's thinking of the idea of a material substance. So does that idea have so much objective reality that I couldn't have made it up? Well, the thing is, I'm a substance. I'm a thinking substance, meaning I stay the same as, different pieces of me, different accidents, different properties go through change. So in other words, I'm having different thoughts, I'm having different sense perceptions, but I remain myself. I mean, that's basically what a substance is. It just remains the same through changes in accidental properties. Now, a material substance is a different kind of substance, but I at least have as much reality as a substance. So could I, sorry, that was a bit loud. Could I have come up with the idea of a material substance based on my idea of myself as a thinking substance? It seems possible. I could grasp myself as a substance and then come up with an idea of another kind of substance. Maybe. Hard to say why not. I'll give Descartes that. So anyway, all roads lead to what? God. Well, there is this idea of God in me. Why is that the idea with so much objective reality that I couldn't have made it up? Well, it's the infinity in there. So God is supposed to be an infinite being. God has infinite wisdom. God has infinite power. That's what I couldn't have come up with, says Descartes, at least. I'm a finite being, right? I know my power is limited because I can't do everything I want, and I know my knowledge is limited because I have to seek out knowledge, right? And I know my charisma is limited because not everybody is my friend, right? Etc. Etc. There are all these different dimensions of goodness or perfection, and I'm finite in all those dimensions, but God is infinite in all those dimensions. All the real ones, right? I mean, on Descartes' view, evil is a lack of goodness. That plays a role in the fourth meditation as well. Okay, so if you think about what really exists, these are positive aspects of reality. They're all good. Reality is good. Creation is good. Descartes is coming at this from a Christian perspective, right? And so God has, infinite positive characteristics, right? Whatever dimension of reality you can think of, God has that infinitely, right? Oddly, except for spatial dimensions. For whatever reason, God's just a spiritual being. That's Descartes' view. Spinoza ends up rejecting that because, ultimately it doesn't make sense. Descartes is saying God is full, unlimited reality in every dimension, in every aspect. Oh, except space, except the spatial dimensions. So Spinoza just bites the bullet and says, yep, every dimension, including spatial ones. Okay, anyway, I'm finite. I'm aware of that. We went over that. I'm aware of my limitations. So I can't have come up with the idea of infinity on my own. I mean, this makes some sense as far as it goes. If you add up finite things, you won't get to infinity unless you add them up over infinite time, unless you have like an infinite sequence of addition. You can't just jump from the finite to the infinite. You have to give the infinite to get the infinite, right? You see what I'm saying? I mean, I could sit here and I can add up 10 plus 10 plus 10, 10 plus 10. When do I get to infinity? Well, over infinite time, right? So there's this gap, right, between the finite and the infinite. And right, in the case of material substance, I was just saying, well, I am a substance, so I could just try to think of a different kind of substance, call it material, and it has these different kinds of properties. But there's this other gap, so that's a gap between two different kinds of substances, two different kinds of finite substance we could add, and that seems like maybe surmountable, but how do you get from the finite to the infinite? Well, again, I was just saying, well, you have to sort of give infinity to get infinity, it seems like. So I hope that's clear. So that's where Descartes' head is. And so he says, this idea of infinity that I have, it's really robust. It's really, it's substantial. It's something that I can, that I know isn't a false idea. So that's where things get even trickier for Descartes, right? So with some ideas he's confused about, which are real. In other words, pairs of ideas is what I was thinking of. With cold and heat, we're pretty sure that cold is the absence of heat, but of course we've got modern physics to help us out with that. Descartes not so sure. He's sure that darkness is the absence of light, but cold feels like its own phenomenon. So he does say, like, that's a bit confusing. My sensory ideas aren't that clear and distinct. If they were more clear and distinct, I could know whether cold is really the absence of heat, but actually I don't know. Cold seems like a phenomenon of its own. So anyway, Descartes says that's not the case with my idea of infinity. I grasp it well enough to know that this is the most rich and real idea that there is, and other real and rich ideas have to participate in this idea. So in the realm of ideas, there's a sort of prime idea that other ideas get their reality from. So Descartes claims, right? Could I have cobbled together the idea of the infinite God from different pieces? Well, I already mentioned you have to add infinity to get infinity, but also Descartes says, well, one of the things about God is that he's completely simple, right? So could I just, think about infinite power over here and infinite wisdom over here and infinite charisma over here and, be getting them from different places and then put them together into this simple idea of a unified God? Descartes says no, right? How could I think of God as simple unless all the dimensions were presented to me at once in a coherent idea, right? If my idea of God specifically is simple, then I need to have a simple presentation of all those infinite aspects of God's reality. And Descartes says he does have a presentation like that in his own mind. If that were true, then I would say this argument works. There are two different issues. There's this issue of, possibly not even knowing what Descartes means, and there's this other issue that whatever it means, it's probably false. So what does it mean for me as a finite being to have a grasp of the idea of the infinite? I'm not sure what that means. So that's a problem. Descartes ends up saying he can sort of touch the idea of the infinite, even though he can't fully grasp it, because he's finite, right? So we're talking about the idea of the infinite. So he can sort of touch it, and he's close enough to it to know that it's there and it has this robust positive reality. I'm not sure I know what that means. So you think about whether you know what that means. That's up to you. And then also, is it true? Well, what's plausible here? Descartes is insistent that you can't get to the infinite by negating the finite, by saying no to the finite. But I'm not so sure. That seems plausible to me, right? From a David Hume point of view, from a Humean point of view, we'll study David Hume later in the course. Where would you get an idea of omnipotence, of being all-powerful? Well, you'd think of a powerful thing like your car, maybe. I don't want to be run over with my car. It might kill me. That would hurt. So my car is powerful. but then a semi-truck is more powerful, but then a tank is more powerful than that. But then, the Earth's gravitational field is, in some sense, more powerful than the tank. The tank is sort of bound to the ground. It doesn't have any way of reaching escape velocity unless we, imagine some things that don't need to be imagined to imagine a tank. But then the sun's gravitational field is more powerful than the Earth's, and the gravitational field of the entire galaxy is more powerful than that of the sun. And, this is how you get the idea of infinite power, David Hume would say, and it seems plausible. You think of something powerful and you negate it. You think, well, that's not the most powerful. This other thing is more powerful, but that's not the most powerful either. So you're negating, here's this other thing I can think of that's more powerful. And you keep going, and then you say, well, of course, the galaxy is not the most powerful thing. The whole universe, what if the universe were even bigger than it is? And whatever, you can just keep imagining, you can keep negating the power that you're familiar with, that you have experience of, and thinks, well, there's possibly something more powerful. And it's the same with wisdom. I was in graduate school a long time. I have some amount of wisdom. I've lived a life. I've got some kids that I have to raise, and it's been difficult, and I've gained some wisdom. But sure, Mahatma Gandhi, more wise than me, absolutely, right? And but Gandhi maybe wasn't as wise as Socrates, right? Was there anyone wiser than Socrates? Well, maybe. So we could keep going. Well, never mind Socrates. What about King Solomon or whoever? And then you can just start imagining possible wise people. Well, if somebody could combine this kind of wisdom with this kind, and right, again, what's your path to the very idea of infinite wisdom? Well, it certainly could proceed through negation, which is what Descartes has to deny to get his argument to work. He's saying he's got a positive idea of the infinite, right? And he knows he couldn't have produced it because there it is. He can touch it. It really is infinite in objective reality. And so he couldn't have produced it, even as an objective thing, right? Even as a mere idea. He couldn't have produced it. It must have entered him from outside. But if you get at the infinite through negating the finite, which he denies is possible, then you actually don't have this rich positive idea of the infinite. It's more vague than that. It's more indefinite than that. Okay. So Descartes' view is this works. And of course, the idea of God has to turn out to be innate, because we were already saying I couldn't have made it up, and it couldn't have come to me from the outside through my senses, because my senses are finite. So it's just sitting there in my mind. It's just God just put it in there, like a mark of his craftsmanship, Descartes suggests. Okay, so from Descartes' point of view, the argument works, and there's the idea in your mind. It's innate. It didn't come from somewhere. It's just been there the whole time. And when you look at it, you know that God is infinitely good. Consult your innate idea. You'll know that God is infinitely good. Therefore, clear and distinct ideas that I have are reliable. Therefore, arithmetic and geometry our sources of knowledge. That's where we've been aiming at. That's what we've been trying to get to. Arithmetic and geometry really are sources of knowledge. Okay, so that's a big addition to our pile, our structured pile of knowledge, right? So that if that worked, that would be great. Then we would be going forward in our quest for knowledge with arithmetic and geometry sort of tucked under our belts, and that would really help with science, right? But if I seem skeptical of this argument, please take that at face value. Yes, I am skeptical. I don't really see how the argument could work. It suggests an argument that is a little more convincing. Descartes says, I couldn't have thought of the infinite because I'm finite. And as a matter of fact, my thought of the finite depends on the thought of the infinite. This issue of dependency is an interesting one. Descartes could have fleshed that out. Things can depend on other things, but only up to a point, right? So Descartes exists and is dependent. The things that produced him, like his parents, for instance, are also dependent, or philosophers like to say contingent. Things that could exist or could just as well not exist, those things are contingent. Descartes is contingent, his parents were contingent, his parents' parents were contingent. There is an interesting issue here about, given that Descartes exists, is a chain of contingent causes enough to account for that? Any contingent cause could exist or could just as well not exist depending on other things behind it or prior in time to it, right? And so that's a different argument. I'm not going to develop that. But yeah, there is this argument called the argument from contingency. How does a contingent thing get to exist? Don't you need something to be necessary? Right? Either way back in time, maybe like there's this initial being that has to exist, that is sort of responsible for its own existence, and that sets everything into motion. Or if you had an infinite chain of contingent beings, shouldn't there be some reason the contingent being exists, and wouldn't that reason have to be sort of necessary in order to explain all these contingencies? Because if it was a further contingent thing, then you would ask, well, what's it based on? What's it conditioned on? What's the contingency based on? So that, that's kind of a puzzle for you to think about. Descartes could have developed that line of thought. It would have been more convincing than what he did. What he did was claim that some ideas have more objective reality than others. His idea of the infinite God has the most objective reality. He couldn't possibly have constructed that idea, so it must have been put in him by something that's actually infinite. There are some problems there, as we've discussed. Okay, so let's leave it at that. That's meditation 3. I hope you've had a nice time. I know I have. Thanks a lot.